The candles had been lit for 30 minutes before the guests arrived, and by the time the first footstep sounded on the marble of the entrance hall, Constance Adley had already memorized the arrangement of the silver, the count of the chairs, and the precise weight of the Duchess's dining room pressing down on her like a hand at the throat. She was sitting in the wrong seat. That was the only thought that kept circling. Quiet and persistent, beneath the performance she was attempting. The chair at the head of the table was the Duchess of Fenwick's chair. Everyone who had ever dined at Fenwick Park knew whose chair it was: the carved rosewood back, the cushion in blue silk, the placement nearest the portrait of the fourth Duke in his military coat. Constance had set that chair straight 100 times. She had never once imagined herself inside it. The Earl of Stanmore entered the dining room and stopped. He was tall and dark-coated, and his stillness when he stopped was the stillness of a man who noticed more than he disclosed. His eyes moved once across the table, the guests already seated, the footmen at their posts, the blue chair at the head, and then they found Constance, and they did not move again for several seconds. His face gave nothing. He crossed to his seat, took it, and said nothing at all. She did not know yet that this silence would matter. She did not know yet that Edmund Hale, the Earl of Stanmore, had already understood everything. 4 hours earlier, Constance had been in the Duchess's boudoir, standing at the window with her hands folded in her apron and her expression composed with an effort that cost her more than she showed. Eleanor, Duchess of Fenwick, sat at her dressing table in her evening gown with both hands pressed flat against its surface, as though the wood were the only thing keeping her upright. "I cannot go down," the Duchess said. Constance had heard this before: a headache, a chill, the season's fatigue. She said what she always said. "Shall I send word to the kitchen, Your Grace? The soup may be delayed. I cannot go down to that table with that man at it." The Duchess turned. Her eyes, always formidably composed, were something other than composed now. "Ashmore has the notes. He has had them since March. If I sit across from him tonight with no one to buffer the conversation, he will demand an answer before the remove is cleared, and I have no answer to give him. The solicitor cannot come until Thursday. I need 1 more week." Constance understood then the shape of what was coming, and her hands tightened against each other inside the apron pocket, where the letter was. Her father's letter, folded 4 times to a small square, sealed with wax she had never broken. She kept it because she could not throw it away. She kept it because the thought of reading it in the empty room where he had died was more than she could manage. She pressed it with her thumb now, through the fabric, a habit she had not named. "You want me to go in your place," Constance said. "Lord Stanmore will be there. He was a friend to my husband, and Ashmore fears him. If Stanmore sees nothing amiss, Ashmore will hold his council for the evening. I need only 1 evening." The Duchess rose and turned fully toward her. This was the part Constance would remember longest. Eleanor, Duchess of Fenwick, whose back had never bowed in 30 years of social performance, was looking at her with something that in another woman would have been called desperation. "I am asking you." The word asking hovered in the room like a note held past its measure. The Duchess did not ask. The Duchess instructed, directed, permitted, declined. Constance could not recall having heard her ask for anything in the 2 years she had served her. "I am a servant girl," Constance said, and the words were not self-pity. They were precision. "Lady Vine will know the moment I sit down. Lady Vine will know what Lord Stanmore allows her to know." The Duchess reached past the perfume bottles and pressed a pair of pearl earrings into Constance's palm. "You were educated. Your father was a scholar. You know how to sit at a table." Constance looked at the earrings in her hand. They were warm from the dressing table's candlelight. What she was about to do was indefensible, and she knew it. The Duchess was asking her to deceive a dining table full of people, to occupy a rank she had not been born to perform a life that was not hers. Her own still life, the small room, the letter she could not read, the mending she did by the light of a single candle before sleep, would be on the other side of this evening, waiting. The Duchess knew precisely what she was asking. Constance knew precisely what it would cost, and yet she thought of her father, who had taught her everything the world refused to credit her for. She thought of the word asking. One evening, Constance said. She went upstairs and changed her dress. If you have ever sat at a table that did not belong to you, you know the particular quality of that awareness. The way the forks seem heavier than they should, the way your back does not quite meet the chair, the way you become conscious of your own hands as instruments someone is watching. Constance settled into the blue silk chair at the head of the Fenwick dining table and became conscious of all of it at once. There were 7 guests. She had been given their names and stations in the corridor, rapid and low, by the Duchess's lady's maid, who had looked at her with the expression of a woman watching a ship sail into uncertain weather. Lord Ashmore, debt holder, with his companion Lady Vine, a junior peer, and his wife, friends of the family, unlikely to cause difficulty, a clergyman who rarely spoke, a retired colonel who would need wine before he engaged with anything, and the Earl of Stanmore, who had stopped in the doorway and looked at her, and then looked at nothing else. She poured her own water. She thanked the footman when he offered the soup. She turned to the colonel on her left and asked about the county roads, because a woman who wished to be understood as a duchess would know about the county roads, and the colonel needed very little encouragement. He had been looking for someone to tell about the roads since October. The soup was a clear consomme, warm and precise, and she lifted the spoon the way she had watched the Duchess lift it for 2 years, from the far edge of the bowl rather than the near, tilted slightly away. And the colonel did not notice because the colonel was speaking about a particular collapsed section near the Stoke turning, and the junior peer's wife was nodding with the expression of a woman who had heard about the Stoke turning before and was managing her feelings about it graciously. The clergyman had already prayed silently over his soup and was now eating it with the meditative efficiency of a man who had long since made his peace with the fact that dinner conversation was rarely edifying. The retired colonel had, as predicted, located his wine. And across the table, and 3 seats to the left, Lord Ashmore was not eating his soup. He was watching her. She had been aware of him since she sat down. Ashmore was the kind of man whose attention was a statement rather than an inquiry, a man who had learned, in the course of acquiring other people's debts, that watching someone was its own form of pressure. He had not spoken to her yet. He was laying foundations. Lady Vine watched her from across the table. Lady Vine was a slender woman of 50 with the posture of a woman who considered observation a blood sport, and she was watching Constance with the precise attention of someone waiting for a seam to pull. She had arrived in a gown of deep violet, beautifully made, with diamonds at her throat that were just slightly too large for the occasion, and were almost certainly chosen for that reason. She said nothing for the length of the soup. It was only when the footman began to serve the fish that she leaned toward Ashmore and said, in a voice calibrated to be heard by Constance and by the Earl, who sat 2 places down, "I was not aware the Duchess of Fenwick had taken to sending a servant girl, and nothing more to host her own dinner." The table did not visibly react, but it listened. Constance felt the listening, the way you feel weather through glass, that particular quality of stillness that means everyone has heard, and no one wishes to be seen to have heard. She lifted her fork. She set it down again. She turned to Lady Vine and said, with a quietness that was not meekness, "The fish appears to be the brill from the Dorset coast, Lady Vine. The Duchess imports it specially. I hope it answers." A beat of silence. Lady Vine's smile remained in place. It was the smile of a woman who had not lost anything yet, and knew it. "How very informed you are," she said sweetly. "Of the fish." The Earl, for the first time since soup, looked at her directly. Not at her dress or her chair or her composure, but at her face. And for the length of 2 seconds she felt that gaze as something specific, something that registered the whole of her rather than any particular deficiency. She did not look back. She reached for her fork a second time and used it. The fish was, in fact, excellent. Constance had navigated difficult rooms before, though never one with this particular configuration of steaks. Her father, the Reverend Thomas Adley, had kept a scholar's house in the parish at Kelwick, books stacked against every wall, visitors who argued in Latin over supper, the kind of dinner table where a child was expected to listen and then to answer when she was addressed, and to answer correctly. She had learned to hold her knife the way a gentleman's daughter held a knife. She had learned to decline in 3 languages and to speak of weather as an aperture into larger subjects. She had learned, specifically, how to sit at a table and disagree with a man of greater authority without appearing to disagree. Her father had called it the scholar's method, which was to ask rather than assert, and to ask in the form most likely to make the other person reach the correct conclusion on their own. She had watched him do it with the diocesan bishop, who was vain. She had watched him do it with the county magistrate, who was worse. She had spent 22 years attending her father's table, and what she had never understood until this evening was that she had been trained all along for precisely this room, this chair, this particular configuration of men. What she had not been given was rank. Rank required birth, and her birth had given her only her father's learning and his debts, which had reduced her 2 years after his death. To this, a household in which she was competent and invisible, useful and unacknowledged. The Duchess had borrowed her mind for 2 years without naming it as such. She had carried letters to solicitors and read account books aloud and managed the calendar of a woman who had no patience for management, and in return she had been given a room, a wage, and the reliable absence of acknowledgement. The letter in her apron pocket, upstairs now, in the dress she had folded carefully before changing, was the last thing her father had written her. She did not know what it said. She had not been able to read it. She had carried it for 14 months, not because she had forgotten it was there, but because she knew with a precision she had not examined that the morning she broke the seal would be the morning she finally accepted that the life she had known before was finished and would not return. If you had told her this morning that she would open it tonight, she would not have believed you. She did not know yet what tonight would bring. Across the table and 3 seats to the left, the Earl of Stanmore was doing something that would have been invisible to anyone watching him. He was listening to her with his entire body while appearing to attend only to the Colonel, who had now turned his attention from the roads to the inadequacy of provincial magistrates. Stanmore's glass moved twice. His profile did not shift, but every silence she produced, every careful redirection of Lady Vine, every small measured exchange with the junior peer about his sister's presentation at court. Stanmore caught all of it, and filed it, and did not speak. He had come tonight as a favor to a dead man. The late Duke of Fenwick had been the kind of man you did favors for even after his death, because to refuse would have been to suggest that friendship had terms. Edmund had not wanted to come. He had not wanted to come to anything in 3 years, and he had grown very good at declining. until the Duchess's letter had arrived with its reminder of the Duke's last hunting party and its quiet sentence about Ashmore's attendance, and he had understood that he was being asked not as a guest, but as a counterweight, and the obligation had been real enough to move him. He had not expected to be made to notice someone. He had, in 3 years, become quite proficient at not noticing people. After Margaret, after the particular quality of silence that followed a household where there had been a woman and then was not, he had found that the most reliable management was simply to look at nothing long enough that nothing became the natural condition. He attended his estates. He read. He responded to correspondence in the necessary register and made no excess of warmth in any direction. It had not been contentment, but it had been livable, and he had not looked for more because looking for more required believing that more existed. The woman in the blue chair was not the Duchess. He had known this before he sat down. The Duchess was 53. Fair, with the bearing of a woman who managed difficulty through architecture, the placement of furniture, the arrangement of light, the strategic deployment of footmen. This woman was perhaps 22, with dark hair dressed simply and well, and the bearing of someone who had learned to manage difficulty through stillness. He turned the thought over. Learned. That was what arrested him. The manner was not native to a life of leisure. The manner was a construction, careful and precise, built by someone who had studied what it should look like, and had nearly, very nearly, made herself believe it. He had been that construction once, before Margaret died. He recognized the effort. He recognized it the way you recognize a language you were once fluent in, and thought you had forgotten. After the third remove, Ashmore put his fork down and looked down the table at Constance with the expression of a man who had finished calculating. "I had understood from the Duchess's note," Ashmore said pleasantly, "that she would be joining us this evening." "Her Grace sends her regrets," Constance said. She had rehearsed this. A persistent indisposition. "A persistent indisposition," Ashmore repeated, in the tone of a man repeating something to demonstrate he had not believed it the first time. "That is unfortunate. I had hoped to speak with her about the quarterly notes. They mature, I believe, on the 15th. I am certain her Grace is aware of the date." "I am certain she is." Ashmore's gaze moved over her with a patience that was its own form of threat. "And you are? A companion? A relation?" Before Constance could answer, Lady Vine said, "She is a servant girl and nothing more, Ashmore. A lady's maid, I would guess, judging by the dress." Her voice was sweet. "The pearls are the Duchess's, I believe. I attended the reception where she wore them last spring." The table went quiet in the way that tables go quiet when something has been damaged and no one is yet sure how badly. Constance held her chin level. She did not touch the earrings. It was the junior peer's wife who spoke first, into the silence, with the bright, determined voice of a woman who hated conflict. The brill was remarkably fresh for this far inland, was it not? She looked to the colonel, who rallied. The conversation lurched forward. Ashmore did not look away from Constance. If you wish to understand what occurred in the next 20 minutes, you must understand the shape of her particular courage. It was not loud. It did not announce itself. It manifested as precision in circumstances designed to produce panic, and it had been trained by years of watching her father sit with debtors and magistrate and diocesan boards and hold the line of what was true and what was owed without raising his voice above the register. It lived in naturally. Ashmore began asking questions about the estate's accounts, about the solicitor's schedule, about a specific note signed by the late Duke in the spring of the year before his death. They were not questions any companion or lady's maid would be expected to answer. They were questions designed to expose her. She answered 3 of them. Not with invented knowledge. She had no invented knowledge to offer. She answered with the specific details she had absorbed in 2 years of managing the Duchess's correspondence, filing the household accounts, and carrying papers between the estate office and the boudoir, while the Duchess asked her to read the relevant paragraphs aloud. She said, "I believe the solicitor, Mr. Carver of Ludgate, is expected Thursday to address the quarter-day arrangements." She said, "The note you are describing was witnessed by the steward, Hargreaves, who remains on the estate." She said, "You might confirm the terms with the estate's man of business, rather than with Her Grace directly." Across the table, Stanmore's glass had not moved. His eyes were on her. She felt them, not as pressure, but as something opposite to pressure, something she did not have a word for, a quality of attention so entire it almost felt like shelter. She did not look back. Ashmore sat for a moment with his lips pressed together. Then he said, quietly, "This is not the Duchess." "No," Constance said. "It is not." No one at the table spoke. The colonel looked at his wineglass. The clergyman folded his napkin. Lady Vine's expression was the expression of a woman who had been waiting for precisely this and was now savoring its arrival. The doors opened. Eleanor, Duchess of Fenwick, stood in the entrance of her own dining room in her evening gown, her expression the expression of a woman who had been listening through the door for some minutes and had made a decision about what kind of woman she was going to be in the next 30 seconds. She looked at Ashmore. She looked at Lady Vine. She looked at Constance. "Your Grace," Ashmore said, rising. "Your servant has been representing herself at your table." "She is a servant girl, Your Grace," Lady Vine added, with the warmth of someone performing a kindness. "Nothing more. She overstepped, I'm afraid. Quite without your sanction." The Duchess looked at Constance. This was the moment. Constance had known a version of it was coming. She had not known from which direction. The Duchess's eyes were the eyes of a woman calculating the cost of 2 different paths, and Constance, who had read those eyes for 2 years, read the calculation clearly. One path cost the Duchess her dignity. One path cost only Constance. "She acted without my sanction," the Duchess said. Her voice was even. "She is a servant girl. I am sorry for the confusion she has caused." The room did not move. Constance stood. She was in the blue chair with the rosewood back, in the Duchess's pearls, in the dress she had borrowed from a trunk of the Duchess's old mourning clothes that happened to fit her reasonably well. And every person in the room was watching her. And the word servant hung in the air above the table like a verdict that had already been read. She did not look at the Duchess. She did not look at Ashmore. She was looking at the candles in the center of the table. And she was deciding what her face would do. And she had already decided that it would not do what Lady Vine was hoping for, which was to crumple. Her father had sat across from men who wanted to watch him crumple. And he had not. She had learned it from him the way you learn things from people you love, without noticing, until the moment you need it. She set her napkin on the table. She said, "I beg your pardon for any disruption I have caused." She meant to stand and go, and she might have, except that the Earl of Stanmore rose from his seat. He did not rise quickly. He was the kind of man for whom every physical gesture was deliberate. The unbending from the chair, the straightening of the coat, the 2 steps that brought him around the end of the table to the side where she was standing. He moved with the specific, unhurried authority of a man who had decided something and was not in a hurry because the deciding was already done. He stopped beside her chair. The room watched. He turned toward the table, toward Ashmore, toward the Duchess. toward Lady Vine with her sweet and watchful expression, and he said in a voice that did not rise and did not require volume, "Miss Adley was invited to this table as my guest. The evening has been entirely satisfactory." 10 words. Lady Vine's fan, which she had been resting on the tablecloth, became very still. Ashmore looked at Stanmore for a long moment, and Stanmore looked back at him with the quality of attention he had turned on nothing for 3 years. And what Ashmore saw in it was the thing that made Ashmore, finally, sit back down. The Duchess said nothing. Her face had the look of a woman who had just watched the ground rearrange itself beneath her feet, and was not yet certain what the new configuration meant. She stood in the doorway of her own dining room, and she looked at the Earl, and what passed across her expression was not guilt and not remorse, but something more complicated. The recognition that the move she had made to protect herself had been answered by a move she had not anticipated from a quarter she had not been watching. Constance looked at the Earl of Stanmore. He was standing very close to her, close enough that she could have placed her hand on his arm without reaching, and she did not. But her body registered the proximity the way her body had been registering it since the fish course, without her permission and without her approval, a warmth along her side that was entirely irrational and entirely specific, and had nothing to do with the dining room or the pearls or the 10 words he had just spoken into the room's held breath. It had to do with the way he had watched her handle Ashmore during the removes without once intervening, and with what that restraint implied about how he had seen her, not as something fragile that required his intervention, but as something sufficient that deserved the room to continue. She had not felt sufficient in a very long time. He offered his arm. She took it. If you are asking what she felt, understand that what she felt was less like triumph than like the moment when you have been holding your breath so long that the first breath back is almost painful. There was the dining room. There were the candles. There was Lady Vine with her still fan, and Lord Ashmore with his papers, and the junior peer's wife whose bright voice had failed her, and the clergyman who was studying the tablecloth with great attention. There was the Duchess. Constance walked out of the room on the Earl's arm. If you are asking what she felt in that corridor, understand that what she felt was less like triumph than like the moment when you have been holding your breath for so long, that the first breath back is almost painful. There was the dining room behind her, with its candles and its company, and Lady Vine's still fan and Lord Ashmore's papers, and the Duchess still in the doorway doing something complicated with her face that Constance did not look back to read. There was the marble of the hallway floor under her feet, and the cool air of the corridor after the heat of the dinner, and the Earl's arm under her hand, which was solid in the way that things are solid when you have been standing on uncertain ground for several hours, and did not know you needed something solid until it was there. She released his arm at the corridor's turn. "Thank you," she said, because there was nothing adequate, and adequate was not available, and something needed to be said. He inclined his head. He did not tell her it was nothing. He did not instruct her not to worry. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "The anteroom. To your left." He brought her to the small anteroom off the entrance hall, the room the family used for waiting between the carriage and the house on wet evenings, with its bench and its lamp and its narrow window giving onto the kitchen garden. It was not a room for guests. It was a room for in-between. He seemed to know it was the right room without being told. He did not speak immediately. He set a lamp on the bench and stepped back to give her the distance the space permitted, which was not much. The room was small, but which was its own kind of consideration. Constance sat on the bench. The evening had folded itself back into silence. the way evenings did once the performance stopped. Her hands were in her lap. The pearls were still in her ears. Her own dress, plain and dark, was upstairs, waiting for her like a life she had left in a drawer. Her hand moved to her pocket. Not the apron pocket, the pocket of the borrowed morning dress, where she had placed the letter before coming downstairs, the way she always moved it when she changed her dress. Without thinking, a reflex so habitual it was almost like breathing. 4 folds of paper, worn soft along the creases. 14 months of carrying without reading. She took it out, her father's handwriting on the outside. Her name, in the particular slant he used when he was being careful. Constance. Not Miss Adley. Not Connie, as he had called her as a child. Just Constance, as if he knew she would be older when she read it. She broke the seal. The door had not closed, and the Earl of Stanmore was still in the room, and she was aware of him with that same lateral awareness she had carried through dinner. But she did not look up. She read. He had not said what she might have feared. He had not described his illness or his fear or the specific mechanics of what was coming for him. He had said only what he had always said, in the long, patient way of a man who believed his daughter was listening, even when she was not in the room. That she was worth every argument the world was inclined to make against her. That he had not been able to give her what the world recognized, only what the world could not remove. That the letter in the book, she would know which one, there was always a letter in the book he was reading at the end, contained the name of the man who owed him a debt of courtesy, if not of money, a man who had known her father at Oxford, and would, if applied to, give his daughter a reference beyond what a lady's maid required. She had not known there was a letter in a book. She had not known there was a man who owed her father anything. 14 months. She set the letter on her knee and looked at it, and her eyes were not dry, but the feeling was not grief in the way it had been. It was something more specific, more navigable, the feeling of a door she had been afraid to open turning out to lead somewhere. "Forgive me," the Earl said. He was sitting on the other end of the bench. She did not know when he had sat down. He had not asked. He had simply done what the room seemed to require. "I should not be here." "You do not need to stay," she said. "No," he said. He did not move. She folded the letter carefully along its old lines. Outside the narrow window, the kitchen garden was dark, and beyond it the county was dark. And somewhere in the house the dinner guests were managing themselves without her. "You knew," she said. "At dinner. You knew from the beginning. Within the first minutes. And you said nothing." "No." A pause. "You were managing." She thought about that word. Managing. She had been managing her whole life, managing her father's visitors, his accounts, the household after his death, the Duchess's correspondence, the weight of being educated into a world that had no use for what she knew. She was very tired of managing. She said before she thought better of it, "I do not know what you want from this evening." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp was between them on the bench, and it lit his face from the side. And she could see the thing she had been seeing across the table all evening. A man who had been still for a long time, and was now, against his evident preference, moving. "I came tonight," he said slowly, "as an obligation. I expected to eat badly and talk about the county roads and go home before 10 o'clock. His eyes moved to the letter in her hands, briefly, and away. "I did not expect to spend the fish course, hoping no one else at the table would notice you." The warmth along her side was back. She did not permit it to show on her face. She said, "You could have intervened earlier." "You did not need me to intervene earlier." This was true, and the truth of it was its own kind of gift, and she felt it as one, not as sentiment, but as accuracy. He had watched her, and he had waited, not because he doubted her, but because she was not failing. She looked at him then, directly, for the first time all evening. He was looking back. Not in the way Ashmore had looked at her, taking inventory of the gaps. Not in the way Lady Vine had looked at her, watching for the seam to pull. He was looking at her with the specific attention of someone who had seen something he did not know how to put down. "The reference in my father's letter," she said. "The man who knew him at Oxford." She smoothed the folded paper. "Do you know the Reverend Adley? He was vicar of Alderton before he was moved to the parish at Kelwick." Stanmore's face changed, only slightly. The jaw, the quality of the stillness. But she saw it. "I knew a man at Oxford," he said, "who argued with me for 2 hours over a passage in Seneca, and was entirely correct and entirely unwilling to concede the point gracefully." She looked at him. He said, very carefully, "You are Thomas Adley's daughter." "Constance Adley," she said. "His only child." He was quiet for a moment that carried more weight than the sentences on either side of it. Then he said, "He wrote to me 2 years ago." I did not reply in time. She understood then, something she had not understood. The letter was not a surprise to him. The debt of courtesy her father had named was not abstract. The man who had known her father at Oxford was sitting 3 feet from her on a bench in the anteroom of the Duchess of Fenwick's house, and he had known who she was before she told him, and he had not said so. "Why?" she said. "Did you not reply in time?" The question sat between them. He looked at the lamp. "My wife died," he said. 3 years ago. In the year of your father's letter, I was not replying to anyone." She had not known this. She held the information with the care it required. "I am sorry," she said. "Yes." He looked at his hands. She was very well, until she was not. It was the kind of loss that has no logic to it, and I have found that what has no logic cannot be managed. He paused. "I believe you know something about that." She thought about the letter she had been unable to read for 14 months, about the apron pocket, about the reflex of carrying it without opening it, because opening it meant the last thing her father had said to her would be said and then finished. "I opened it tonight," she said. He looked at the letter in her hands. "I think," he said after a moment, "that you opened it because this evening was the kind of evening that makes you want to know what was waiting." She did not answer. She did not need to. If you have been in a room with someone who understands you without requiring explanation, you know the particular quality of that silence. It is not empty. It is not awkward. It is the silence of 2 people who have arrived, by different roads, at the same place, and are both noticing that the other is there. Outside the window, the first snow of November was beginning. She could hear it, or thought she could. That soft absence of wind, that means snow is falling. The lamp made the window dark, so she could not see it. But she felt it in the quality of the air, the way the house held itself differently when the weather changed. She held the letter. He sat beside her. The dinner guests would be departing. The Duchess would be managing the remaining conversation in the drawing room, which was her particular skill. And Ashmore would go away with his notes unresolved for another week, and Lady Vine would tell the story of the servant girl in the blue chair to everyone she knew until the story found a shape that satisfied her. None of it seemed very large from this room. In the spring, when the matter of references was pursued through proper channels and the man of business made his arrangements, and the country house where Constance had spent her 2 invisible years receded into a particular of her history, she would think sometimes of the letter. Not of the words in it, which she now knew, but of the carrying, the 14 months of the weight of it in her pocket, the thumb pressing through fabric, the habit of it. And she would think that her father had known she would carry it until the right night. She did not know yet that Stanmore would call on Thursday. She did not know yet the specific quiet ceremony of his second visit, the library, the chair he brought close to hers without asking, and then sat in for 3 hours while they read different books in the same room. She did not know yet about the following spring, the estate he named aloud in the same register he used for everything, matter of fact and complete, and the word Constance, used deliberately, her name in his voice, arriving for the first time. She knew only what the room contained, the lamp, the letter, the snow outside the dark window, and the Earl who had sat down beside her without asking, and had not moved. It was enough. It was, she thought, more than she had been taught to expect. And she held it carefully, the way she had learned to hold things the world did not intend for her. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 9. She refolded her father's letter. She placed it in the pocket of the borrowed dress. The Earl did not speak. He looked at the dark window, and she looked at the lamp. And outside, the snow was falling on the kitchen garden, and the lane, and the long road back to the county, covering everything in the specific silence that comes after an evening has ended, and before you yet know what the morning will hold. If Constance's story has stayed with you this evening, consider leaving a word below, a favorite moment, or only that you were here. Stories like this one are built for listeners who believe, as her father did, that quiet worth is worth the carrying. Thank you for staying until the end. She did not open the door. He did not ask her to. They sat a while longer in the anteroom that belonged to no one in particular, while the house settled around them, and the snow came down outside, and the candle on the bench between them burned until it was low, and then lower, and the light it made grew warm and small and entirely sufficient. The letter lay folded in her pocket, and she knew now what it said, and that was enough.